the American sculptor David Smith was of the opinion that in the history of human beings, pictures, visual images came, as he said, even before song. Now that's a proposition which it can never be proven or disproven, of course, but the evidence in favour of the visual image is extensive. And certainly the desire to make images is one of the characteristics that define our humanity, I think. And among those images, and perhaps the first among them, is the self-portrait. And I like to understand these hands as marking the emergence of the awareness of self. And that great perplexity, therefore, of the human being that it signifies, that is, the relationship between the inner and the outer self. And it's from contemplating that fundamental question of the relationship between the inner and the outer self that a quality of mystery, I think, arises in portraiture, both self-portraiture and the portrayal of others. And it's a quality which I personally don't find present in other genres of representational art. Now, in highly sophisticated traditions like our own, the mystery can sometimes be obscured by a whole range of factors, not the least of them the intervention of a patron between the portrait and the painter. But at the deepest level, I think the presence of that sense of mystery, or indeed its absence, defines the portrait that succeeds. In Western traditions, portraiture is described as evolving through the Egyptians, the Greeks, and through Roman cultures, in what seem to me to be two main branches. That's to say the celebration of social elites and the interpretation of orally transmitted or indeed literary bodies of myth. Now those two branches are closely related, of course, since the belief systems upon which many civilizations were built blurred the distinction between living rulers and gods. And indeed, the traces of that ambiguity persisted in Western Europe right into the 17th century. And if you look at, for instance, princely portraiture right down to the Stuarts in England, those pictures are invested with a layer of meaning which is quite difficult for us to understand from our modern perspective, and it has its origins in this confusion between myth and reality. In the Roman tradition, in fact, we begin to see not just portraiture of rulers, of demigods, but also the celebration of the wider elites of the rich and the powerful. This is just such an image. However, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire brought a change in the nature of material culture through northern continental Europe, including Britain, which seems to have resulted in the demotion of portraiture. Only towards the end of the early Middle Ages does it reappear in Britain and in what is becoming, at that period, Wales. There's one caveat to add to that, which is that any discussion of this period, we have to be careful because there's no surviving evidence of wood carving and polychrome painting on wood, a tradition which must surely have existed in Wales, and we don't know what was portrayed in that tradition, so there's that caveat. But portraiture in the early medieval period, again, represents both living and mythological figures. And in these two examples on the screen, we can see that distinction clearly between the imaginative depiction of Mary and John at the foot of the cross and the portrait of the local warlord. However, at this period, of course, and in what is a very difficult medium, the contemporary figure, the warlord there, is not identified by physiognomy. He's identified by visual symbols and by literary interpolation. Portraiture was also maintained, of course, in the manuscript tradition, though unsurprisingly, given the monastic context in which most of it was made, those depicted were often, most often, figures taken from Christian mythology, especially portraits of the saints, like this one from the Book of Chad. The saints were identified by a symbol system, common to all the Latin-based cultures of Europe and repeated with only minor variations and some local variations over a period of hundreds of years. Nevertheless, even in the monastic context, the patron portrait does also creep in from time to time. Now, the conventional dating of the Llanbadon cross over there probably precludes Cillian, the father of the illuminator of the Llyfrgell Psalter here, as the subject of the carved portrait it carries. It's probably not in the gaps too much. But it is possible, nevertheless, that we have here an image of a living religious leader rather than of a mythologized saint, but who knows. In the later Middle Ages, manuscript and carved portraits of secular figures, of course, proliferate. This portrait here depicts Robert Fitzstephen, who was the first patron of Strata Florida before the Lord Rees, and it is closely contemporary with his life. It's an Irish manuscript, in fact. And again, it's an imaginative portrait in the sense that you can't, from looking at it, say that Robert Fitzstephen had brown hair. That's not an inference you can draw. But the observed portrait will, in fact, soon re-emerge, as we shall see. That's to say, the portrait in which the sitter is particularised by physiognomy. Now, for obvious reasons, it's the faces of the elite, which we usually find in these early images, emerging at first. But at Penmon, we have what suggests an extraordinary exception to that rule in a carving of a mason. He's identified as a mason by his axe, the axe that he carries there. And perhaps he also has some indications of particularization, maybe the beard. Again, we don't know, but it is tempting to interpret this as a self-portrait of the mason who carved the tympanum and other elements of that Romanesque church. Throughout the High Middle Ages, the secular world and the world of myth coexist and interact in carved portraiture, largely in the context of the church, though once again there's a caveat we have to make there, which is that the survivals in churches are much greater than the survivals from medieval houses, especially in terms of portable accoutrement of the medieval elite. Not much survives in Wales.